Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me today in session 158 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. This is an interview that I have been just dying to get out and share with you. As you'll hear from some of the references that we've made in the show, to it being 2020 and, in the midst of the pandemic and things like that, you can tell that it was recorded a few months ago. But man, this is just a fun conversation with one of my oldest friends, an Auburn classmate, Dr. Jim Murphy, professor of psychology from the University of Memphis. In this episode, we talk about the perhaps impossibly broad topic of substance use disorders. But fortunately for us, Jim's spent the better part of 2 decades studying this issue from a behavior analytic and behavioral economic lens. And Jim just has that uncanny ability to discuss these really complicated topics in easy to understand everyday terms. What did we talk about in this episode? Well, we talked about a lot of things here. We centered our conversation around his research in motivational interviewing. So we talk about what that is and how he's applied it to, he and his research team how they've applied it to helping people reduce binge drinking, both on college campuses and young adults as well. But we talked about so much more. I'm going to attempt to list some of the things here, just because it's we got into some stuff that I think most people can relate to. We talked about how the environment often plays a key role in substance use, why the abstinence model for problem drinkers may not be the best fit for individuals or for some individuals, why the terms alcoholic and addict are neither descriptive nor helpful, why we should be concerned more about binge drinkers. We talked about certain age ranges that are more at risk for binge-style substance abuse. One of the things we really got into was the interesting research about Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs, and generally talk about why they work, and the pros and cons of them. And we also get into some basics of behavioral economics and talk about how using things like a hypothetical demand curve analysis can be used to assess motivation to reduce drinking behavior. Now, if that sounds like a real fancy term, again, don't worry, Jim explains it and makes it really understandable. He concludes with some advice for BCBAs about motivational interviewing and why we should get more training in that area. And he was also kind enough to stick around to do a patron-only segment on the legalization of cannabis. So he spends about 15 or 20 minutes where we chat about his thoughts on the legalization of cannabis and other substances in various states and communities and so forth in the United States. So if you're interested in learning more about that, go to patreon.com/behavioral observations. One other two quick housekeeping notes. We had a couple of connection issues with the Zoom call. I think they kind of go away over time and doesn't really detract from the overall ability to understand what we're talking about. One other thing I want to mention as well is that, we talk about some of the old days at Auburn, and in doing so, we mention a couple of friends and teachers that we had and things like that. And whenever you do that, you run the risk of omitting other people who are just as valuable, helpful, important to us, etc. So to all our friends from the cohort of 1996, as well as those cohorts that kind of bracketed us, and all the teachers in the Department of Psychology at that time. So I guess apologies in advance for not getting, I wish I could give everyone a special shout out. I could probably do a year's worth of shows just on that era with people from it. So I guess I will just leave it at that before I stick my foot in my mouth even further. Today's episode is brought to you by our institutional patron, Green Space Behavioral Technology. So for more information on their services, they got a lot of cool stuff to offer. Go to greenspacebehavior.com. Also, we're brought to you by the Whoop Strap. And as I've talked about previously, I've been wearing the Whoop Strap for several months now, and it's really great. It gives you lots of cool analytics, both on your exercise and your sleep and things like that. So if that's something you're interested in learning more about, go to behavioralobservations.com/whoop. And you can also feel free to join the Facebook group I put together, Behavior Analysts Who Whoop, and the links to these things are in the show notes. We're also brought to you by Behavior University, where their mission is to provide university quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their CEU offerings, including their brandy new 8-hour supervision course, as well as their RBT trainings over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. And last but not least, I talked about the Patreon group. So if you are interested in jumping on that, Patreon members get early access to podcasts. This particular episode's been out for a few days now. Bonus podcast material like we talked about just a second ago. Discounts on CEU events, not only from the Behavioral Observations CEU store, but also from other purveyors like FTF, where we do occasional Zoom hangouts and lots more. So to check that out, go to behavioralobservations.com and click on the Patreon tab, or just go to patreon.com/behavioralobservations. Okay, I think that's it for opening remarks. Without any further delay, let's get to this fun conversation with Dr. Jim Murphy.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Jim Murphy, welcome to this very long overdue conversation on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How you doing?
Good, Matt. Good to be with you. I appreciate the invitation. It's great to connect.
Yeah. And, I think we've been talking about this for 3 or 4 years now. And it's finally fun to make it happen. It's also of note. We're going to be talking about drinking, and it's 2020 and a pandemic. It's almost a pity we're not doing this in the afternoon or early evening. I'm here with my seltzer, and this would make a fine Zoom happy hour topic. But we're going to talk about drinking and other substance use disorders and things like that, because this has been your area of expertise, and amongst other things. And so I'm looking forward to digging into this at length with you. So before we get to that, though, I want to talk a little bit about your background, and I want the audience to kind of get to know you a little bit. And so, in addition to being one of my oldest friends and classmates from Auburn, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. And let's do that by starting with, how you got into this line of work. What made you get interested in psychology? What made you want to pursue it at the graduate level? And then kind of what led you into this area of behavioral economics and choice making and substances, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to take it from there, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. As an undergraduate psychology major, I think my story was typical in that I was fascinated about what made people tick, what accounted for all the interesting quirks and differences that we all observe in people, and then, how to help people in distress. And so I was interested in clinical psychology. I worked for a year after undergrad in a group home for folks with dual diagnoses, so people with chronic severe mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, and addiction. And I was actually much more interested in the schizophrenia part of the equation, and so wanted to pursue that in graduate school. But that, schizophrenia research is, even at the time in the 90s, late 90s, was really dominated by the sort of biomedical model. It's a disorder for which medications are the frontline treatment. And so there was really no good option to pursue schizophrenia. There was thankfully a great option to pursue addiction research at Auburn with Rudy Vucinic and Jaylee Tucker. And so I kind of increasingly in graduate school became passionate about some of the fundamental issues that arise with alcohol and drug use and addiction, namely, the big picture of sort of why do people drink or use drugs to the point where it does harm? And then also, how do you motivate people to make changes in their use? And so that sort of passion took hold and has essentially defined what I've done for the last 25 years. So
I want to get into your work at Memphis and the lab you've got there and the just kind of wild success you've had academically speaking. But while we're on this kind of historical note, one of the things that occurred to me, and I've joked about this on the podcast before, is that, at least from my recollection, I don't know if this is just nostalgia or anything like that, but it seemed like at the time, especially in our cohort, but especially just in that kind of mid-90s, late 90s era, that behavioral economics was exploding. Is that fair to say from your perspective? And if so, could you, what are your thoughts on kind of being there at that time when you've had, especially with some of the colleagues that we had at the time?
Yeah, no. So I would say that the intellectual climate at Auburn at that time, and in particular in our cohort, and that's due in large part to you and Steve Lawyer and others. It was, as a clinical psychologist, I had the opportunity to learn about behaviorism and about experimental psychology and behavior analysis and behavioral economics from the basic laboratory and theoretical side that was completely unique for a clinical psychologist. And so behaviorism was huge at that point in time. I think more so in the experimental literature and maybe in the sort of developmental disabilities world. At the time in clinical psychology and addiction treatment and research more generally, we were clearly in the midst of the social cognitive revolution. So behavioral economics, when in the mid 90s, was a very obscure, not at all mainstream influence in the clinical addiction world. Since then, it's absolutely exploded, right? And so over the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years, more behavioral and behavioral economic approaches to understanding human drug use and alcohol use and using and guiding treatments has exploded. But certainly the climate at Auburn, I think, positioned me really well to be able to contribute, what were at the time novel ideas to understanding addiction.
It's funny. One of the things I think about, especially with the group of folks in, not just our cohort, but the ones that kind of, above us and below us, is that I think a lot of the clinical folks have gone into academia, and a lot of us folks in the experimental world are now out there doing applied work and applied behavior analysis.
Right.
So the irony of when I look back on our merry band of grad students is not lost, But it's interesting, that background, and certainly, I think you were perhaps humble when you're talking about your exposure to the experimental analysis of behavior. I know you've done a lot of work in that world and probably know more about delay discounting, choice making, matching, et cetera, than many behavior analysts out there. So I did, Jim, interrupt you a little bit in terms of your background a little bit. So I want you to kind of continue the story in terms of telling us about the work that you're doing at the University of Memphis, as well as the lab and some of the types of research that you do there.
Yeah, sure. So the sort of two driving sort of programs of research that I've worked on for the past couple decades. One is trying to understand the decision-making processes that lead people to use alcohol and drugs, right? And in some ways, that doesn't require a lot of explanation because drugs are potent reinforcers. And most humans and animals, when given access to alcohol or some other drug, will find it appealing because it makes them either feel good or feel better, right? Or feel less bad or less bored. And so it's a reinforcer. They will repeat that behavior. So that part, we've known about for a long time. The part that I've tried to study and that I really kind of that grew out of the sort of behavior analytic work at Auburn with Rudy Vucinic and J. Lee Tucker and Tom Critchfield and Chris Newland and others is this idea of understanding alcohol and drug use as being a choice behavior, meaning that the decision to use alcohol or drugs is not just a product of the reinforcing property, the sort of pharmacological properties of the chemical, but it's also a product of the alternatives that are available in the environment. And so going back to the seminal, what are called rat park studies, which is where if you raise rats in an environment where that is devoid of alternatives, they will self-administer high levels of cocaine or other addictive drugs. Conversely, if you raise a rat in an enriched environment where there's running wheels and it's social and there's a number of different, appetizing food options, they will use drugs much less. And so as I was exposed to that, I immediately thought that was a powerfully important finding about drug use that hadn't really fully been incorporated into the clinical literature, both in terms of how we understand addiction and how we treat it. So that's been part of what I've tried to do, is to take that basic laboratory finding and develop applied measures that quantify the amount of alternative reinforcement in the environment, the relative value of drugs compared to the alternatives, the strength of motivation for alcohol and drugs based on how much resources or lever presses, right? To think about it from an animal model, from a human model, it's more about how much time or how much money you'd allocate to alcohol and drugs. So I've explored all that. And then I've also explored treatment approaches, which maybe we could bracket that and talk a little bit more about that later. But that's a lot of what I've done, is try to take that basic animal laboratory work on the determinants of drug self-administration and try to develop clinical measures and try to conduct studies that demonstrate that the environment is also a huge risk factor for human drug use.
You probably already know that Behavior University creates engaging ABA content for new and experienced professionals. Whether it's RBT training or webinars for BACB CEUs, Behavior University has you covered. Behavior University is launching an interactive BACB supervisor training, an innovative approach to supervision training with interactive video to practice decision-making and tools to create a personalized portfolio to take with you when you're done. The course is designed to guide new supervisors through applying the important skills required for effective supervision to their own unique experiences. Behavior University also offers 2 tiers of RBT training. Choose the essentials for the 40-hour course or the premium to add a full kit of study materials and a full-length practice exam. In addition to these features, supervisors can now purchase access to these RBT courses so they can monitor any RBT training for course progress and quiz performance. Supervisors will also receive tools and content to support training of new staff. Users rave about Behavior University RBT training, calling it the clearest instruction, the course that made it stick, amongst other comments. BCBA say that their staff clearly get it after taking their course. So to check out what they've built and to get podcast-specific discounts, head on over to behavioruniversity.com/observations. I see. So yeah, I think that's a helpful way to kind of bracket it. What are the things that motivate drug taking? What are the things that we do to kind of solve that problem? So let's tackle those separately. And I think you started to allude to this, and so I want to give you a chance to kind of maybe expand on this. And that, what does the science currently tell us about alcohol abuse? And you mentioned that behavioral economics, that framework is become more popular in terms of understanding it in this day and age in the so-called addiction literature, I guess. I don't know if there's a better term for that. So what do we know about why people do these things that is, that kind of in terms of not, perhaps you want to talk about impoverished environments and things like that, and how has this point of view perhaps evolved to the extent that it has from what people were thinking about this 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things. One, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the epidemiology of alcohol and drug use, because this has actually been a substantial advancement that has led to more evolved understandings of etiology, right? And the basic, one of the things we've learned over the last 20 years that we didn't used to really appreciate is that there is an entire continuum of levels of alcohol and drug use in the population. So there's a big chunk of people that are abstainers, right? There's a big chunk of people that use occasionally, and that goes for both alcohol and other drugs, but really use in a very controlled way and don't have problems, right? There's a big chunk of people who are sort of binge users, meaning they may binge drink or use other drugs, maybe on weekends, maybe even every, once a month, but it's not a day-to-day compulsive activity, right? Those, and that, depending on the substance, it's that group is most large with drinking, right? That group actually accounts for more total harm than the small group of very severe kind of compulsive daily drinkers or daily drug users that thankfully only reflect about 5% or less of the population. Previously, prior to the last 20 years, all of our etiological models and treatment models were based on our understanding of the 5% or so of the population that are compulsive daily, what we might call physically dependent users, right? And so that led to this dichotomous understanding of either you're a quote unquote addict or you're not, right? That also led to the predominance of sort of brain disease models that understood addiction as a disease, sort of a brain disease that, once the switch is flipped, then use is out of control and compulsive and not responsive to contingencies, right? The epidemiological data suggests that it's a little more complicated than that. And if we want to understand why people use drugs, we have to understand use across that whole continuum and not just use among the sort of very severe group of people.
So someone goes to a Christmas party back when those were being held, and they have the third or fourth martini. They get a DUI on the way home. But they don't have 3 or 4 martinis every day. Is that kind of what you're trying? Is that an example, I guess, of those two different types? Okay.
And there's a lot of people like that, right? So there's, and that segment of the population had been completely ignored by all of our treatment approaches prior to the last 20 years, which told people, if you want help for alcohol or drug use, the first step is to admit that you're an addict and to commit to abstinence, right? And that person you mentioned who goes to work 5 days a week, but does have a problem regulating their use at the holiday party, right? They're left with the untenable choice of either do nothing and then assume, no, this isn't really a problem, or commit to this, inpatient or intensive outpatient treatment program where they have to, take on this identity that doesn't really sit or fit with their reality, right? So that's exactly the person that had been neglected by our sort of treatment infrastructure.
And so with this kind of avatar persona that we're describing here, the infrequent binger, and so just to make sure I'm clear on the distribution of these types of use patterns, that there's more of them than there are of the quote unquote alcoholics, the chronic, and I guess as a related question too, is the term alcoholic problematic, or does that confuse things, or the term addict? I know there's a variety of terms that are used to describe patterns of overuse or abuse or what have you. So I suppose perhaps in your answer, if you want to take the opportunity to kind of clean up how we, our taxonomy of this,
Yes.
by all means, go ahead.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. So, like in many areas of medicine and psychology, the field has moved away from language that objectifies people by their disorder, right? And so instead of saying addict, we say person with addiction. We use what's called person first language, right?
Mm-hmm.
The term alcoholic is especially problematic because it's not person first, and it also doesn't reflect any current clinical classification, right? So in DSM, you have alcohol use disorder and drug use disorder, and you have mild, moderate, and severe, right? And so you have more of a continuous model of either AUD or SUD, right? ICD has a similar approach. So we have moved away from the term alcoholic. We've moved away from the term addict, but not the term addiction, which is still used in a lot of research to describe sort of compulsive use, right? So person first, and also if we're using clinical language, we would say alcohol use disorder, drug use disorder.
Okay. And so there's more people in that kind of binge category than there are in the in the chronic alcohol use disorder category.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so what does the current state of the science tell us about the reasons why someone might? I mean, is it straightforward that is it as straightforward as alcohol or whatever substance is a primary reinforcer, and then when someone gets in an environment like a barbecue or a wedding or a Christmas party, or it's Friday night or something like that, and they're not abusing alcohol or substances the other 5 or 6 days of the week or something like that, what do you have to what do we know about the motivation to kind of get to binge in a severe way like that? And again, I guess my general question is it just that it's these things are primary reinforcers, or are there other aspects of the environments that are perhaps impoverished, kind of like going back to the rat park model, but played out on a human scale? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So at some level, your first answer is correct, right? It's a reinforcing substance. When I teach classes on this, I always start by, you could Google this, Google drunk monkeys. And there's this hysterical National Geographic video that comes up that shows these monkeys on this Caribbean resort island that have been there for hundreds of years. And they will run up on unsuspecting beach-going patrons and steal their drinks, right? And they will run, take the drink, run away. And the video describes how the distribution of preference for alcohol among these monkeys maps on to the distribution in humans, such that there's a small group of monkeys that will drink till the last drop, and they wind up breaking bottles and fighting by the end of the day and passing out, right? There's another group of monkeys that will have a couple drinks and then stop. And there's another group that would rather have soft drinks. They don't have a preference, right? So at some level, that's all that we need to know to explain why we like to drink, right? But one of the things that I think is really fascinating, and that has been eye-opening for me over the last 20 years, is to appreciate that just as much as the chemical properties of the drug, people, in particular alcohol, people drink in order to connect with other people, right? And so we're social animals. In our evolutionary environment, we could only survive for a certain number of days if we were separate from our group, right? There's a reason why we are obsessively preoccupied with our social standing and moved by likes and retweets and all those things. It's because we need people, right? Alcohol, and there's really elegant experimental studies. Michael Sayet at Pitt has done some of this work, where if you bring people into a bar lab and you randomly assign them to either alcohol or placebo, and you introduce them to people they don't know, and it's essentially talk amongst yourselves, and then you have people who are blind to the condition they're in watching a videotape of the interactions and coding them for like how much laughter was there, did everybody get a chance to talk, right, was there smiles? Alcohol objectively improves the quality of social interactions, right? So that's kind of revolutionary, right? It's not just in our heads, it's not just expectancies, it's not just because you think it's going to, that's part of it, right? But it literally makes good times better. And in particular, it helps people to be more open, to connect more with other people. And that in turn leads to deeper social connections that then occur outside of drinking context. So that is another fundamental reason why humans love alcohol so much.
I see. And, I think if my folklore is correct, people have been fermenting stuff to drink for millennia, if I'm not mistaken. And so this is something that's been, going on for quite a long time. So, yeah. Hey, everyone, I want to take a quick break here. We'll get back to Jim very shortly, but I want to talk about the Whoop strap. I've been using the Whoop strap for over 6 months now. I really, really love it. And I think one of the funny things about this particular episode is that the Whoop strap can tell you about your sleep in quite a bit of detail. And it definitely tells you the impact of alcohol on your sleep, because which won't become a surprise to most people, but alcohol impoverishes your sleep. And you can see the degree to which that occurs looking at your sleep data that the Whoop strap provides. But it does a lot more than that. It tracks your workouts, tracks your calories burned. It has some proprietary measures like recovery and strain. We talk about these things in great detail. We talked about it in January with my interview with John Capodilupo, one of the founders of the Whoop strap. So long story short, I really enjoy it. If you want to check it out, or if you want to see examples of real people's data with the Whoop strap, go to Behavior Analysts Who Whoop, the Facebook group. I've got a link to that in today's show notes. And if you do decide to get the Whoop strap and you want to save a few bucks in the process, go to behavioralobservations.com and click on Get the Whoop strap, and you'll be good to go. So I think that's it about the Whoop strap. So if you do get it, I hope you enjoy it. But in the meantime, let's get back to this really fascinating conversation with Jim. I want to ask about what do we do about these people who are, how do we help people who are, for whom alcohol is presenting problems in their lives, I guess. And that's to say, if there's more to say on the motivation before we transition into treatment, by all means, jump in and fill in that gap. But I would like to kind of turn to what do we do to help people who are experiencing problems with alcohol. And I know that's an area that you've done considerably scholarship in. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to chat about that, plus some of the, any relevant studies that you've done that are worthwhile bringing up. Feel free to describe those as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me before we move to treatment, I one other thing I think that is interesting about alcohol, and it sets up the nature of the treatments that I've done and that other people have done, is that alcohol and drug use is, we're learning, it's largely a developmentally bound disorder, right? Meaning that if you plot consumption of alcohol across the lifespan, overwhelmingly, it's people in the 18 to 25, 18 to 29 age range who have the greatest prevalence of binge drinking and of drug use. And interestingly, this is a cross-species biodevelopmental phenomena. There's greater impulsivity among teens and young adults across all animal species. It's adaptive. That's when you need people to be able to fight and go out on their own and take risks and find mates. And so risk taking and being sort of highly reward seeking, like with alcohol and drugs, is a part of the young adult and adolescent brain development. And so that, I think that's important to think about, is that most people do sort of develop the self-regulatory capacity to go to that holiday party, and instead of having 4 drinks, have 2 drinks or 3 drinks, right? Or not drink at all. But the adolescent and the young adult brain is not conducive to making those sorts of decisions. So that was the only other thing I wanted to mention before we sort of move on to helping people.
Well, I think anyone who's been a young person or probably can relate to that. So that's I'm glad you took a minute to point that out. All right, so let's talk about some of the work you've done in kind of, I guess, the assessment and treatment of these repertoires.
Yeah, so this started at Auburn, and I in the late 90s, Alan Marlatt and his colleagues at University of Washington had been influenced by the work. Motivational interviewing, for those who are not familiar with it, is it's a style of interacting with people about sensitive topics and about behavior change that is empowering and is empathic, and takes the approach of wanting to understand from the person's perspective why they engage in the health risk behavior, what are the benefits they see from, let's say, drinking, what they like about drinking, what they don't like about drinking, how drinking fits in with their life. So motivational interviewing, Alan Marlatt had just done a study at UW showing that you could do these brief motivational interviews to reduce drinking among binge drinking college students. And so we wanted to replicate that at Auburn, and wrote a grant to the Department of Education to do a trial that compared what's called BASICS, which is brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students. It's a 2-session. The first session is assessment of drinking patterns and problems. The second session is sort of a consultation feedback session, right, where you sit down with the student, you present them with objective feedback about their drinking. So how many drinks they have in a week, how that compares to population norms, what their percentile rank is as far as drinking. You list out the consequences that they've endorsed from drinking, negative things like getting into fights or hangovers or having their grades suffer. And then you invite them to sort of dialogue about that. Which of these stand out to you? Are there things you'd like to avoid going forward, right? You give them feedback about their blood alcohol level. Many people will be shocked to see when they, these are college students, they might have 7 or 8 drinks in 2 hours. They might not realize that their blood alcohol level is really high, right? To the point where, they could pass out or black out or have, bad things happen. And so what we and others have learned is that you could have this, 1-hour meeting with a young adult who is only there because they're getting extra credit or they're participating in a research study, meaning they have no desire to change, right? And if you structure this conversation well, not only will they not be defensive, but our studies and other people's studies have shown that they will reduce their drinking, all the way out to 12 months. And again, the focus is not abstinence, but it's avoiding the really high risk drinking episodes. So that those sort of brief motivational interviews have been disseminated in tons of different settings now, from the military to colleges and universities, work settings, ERs, any place where you might come into contact with people, not just young people, but anybody who has had some experience with alcohol, or maybe has just completed a screener and has risk for heavy drinking. And you could, in an hour, have an interaction that could be potentially life altering for some people.
So you did this at Auburn, and I know you've done more work at this with not just college students, but young people in general. Again, paying attention to that distribution of the age of which people are likely to engage in these kind of excessive drinking sessions. So, can you talk a little bit about maybe are to the extent to which there are differences? Are there differences between college age students and perhaps young adults who may not necessarily be in college or maybe post college? Or has anything shown up in your research as it relates to that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So college students were historically thought of as a very insulated population that, very sort of privileged, generally middle, upper class. And college drinking was viewed as this benign, funny, clearly not a real issue, right? That was sort of historically how it was viewed. And so initially the idea that it would be important to have interventions with this group was viewed as sort of, how is that an important group, right? They're going to be fine after college. And that's true for many of them. And in particular, young adults who complete a 4-year degree are at lower risk for lifetime alcohol use disorder. That said, the consequences of people binge drinking in college are very real, right? I mean, there's thousands of sexual assaults, physical assaults, people that don't complete college, arrests because of drinking, right? So it's very severe. It also wreaks havoc on college communities. It utilizes a tremendous amount of resources. I was at Brown University for internship and postdoc, and in Providence on a Friday night, if you were having a heart attack downtown, you might not get an ambulance because there were 8 ambulances at Brown and RISD and Providence College picking up college kids who, had drank too much alcohol, right? So it's people realize it's not as benign, right? And that it's significant. That said, and there's been a lot of work to get these interventions out widely disseminated in college settings. And as a result, college drinking has actually gone down a bit over the last decade, right? But only about 40% of the population completes a 4-year college degree, right? And then if you look at residential college students who have the highest rates of drinking when they're in college, that's even smaller. So more recently, the group I focused on is folks who do not complete a 4-year college degree, who increasingly are being recognized as, an incredibly high risk population for almost every negative health outcome, right? So we've heard a lot about deaths of despair, right? This striking increase that is pretty unique to the US is not happening globally in suicide, in alcohol overdose, and in opiate overdose. Almost all of those increases are among middle-aged people without a 4-year college degree. They account for almost all of the increases in those deaths. And we're doing a study right now, a longitudinal developmental study where we're looking at behavioral economic and other risk factors for either escalated alcohol or drug use or sort of decreasing alcohol and drug use during the mid-20s. And what we're finding is similar to what this deaths of despair literature finds is that the folks who didn't complete a 4-year degree have way higher rates of depressive symptoms, alcohol problems, drug problems, even at that age. And they're not so much using opiates yet, but you could see where the heavy drinking is there. It's not going away. And most likely it's sort of a potential gateway to more severe drug use.
I see. And so have you found that this motivational interviewing approach can alter that trajectory with that population as well? Or is that still a question that needs to be explored experimentally?
Yeah, that's actually I am hoping to get a new grant funded maybe any day now that will allow us to do a large clinical trial with non-college young adults recruited from the Memphis community. So it would be a racially diverse sample because we're a majority Black city, but we also have a large white population as well, and so there is some evidence that these approaches do help with non-college young adults, but nowhere near as much evidence as there is with college students, right? And given the higher rates of comorbid anxiety and depressive symptoms in the non-college group, it's probably not enough to just talk with them about alcohol, right? And to try to motivate them to drink less. And so the approach that we've developed over the last decade with college students, and now we're going to try this with non-college, is to have an additional session that is all about increasing enjoyable and goal-directed kind of alcohol-free activities, right, that are consistent with their life goals and their interests, and that are mood-enhancing, and that try to create kind of positive sources of reward that allow them to shift away from drug and alcohol based activities.
I see. So like maybe trying to get them to maybe take up a hobby or something like that, or something like is basically to expand the number of levers in the metaphorical
yes, exactly.
operant chamber. Maybe encouraging to take up hiking or some other type of activity that is perhaps incompatible with substance abuse.
Exactly. Yeah. And in particular, again, going back to humans as social mammals, developing activities and developing social networks that include non-drinkers or light drinkers, right? Because sort of isolated hobbies can be helpful. But when you think about primary reinforcers, potent reinforcers that might compete with alcohol and drugs, we're thinking about social activity. We're thinking about exercise, and we're thinking about meaningful patterns of like service, right? Being involved with the community, church, some other really a passion, right? That leads to goals and progress. Those sorts of rewards seem to be most potent in terms of generating competition, right, for behavior that might reduce the relative value of drinking and drug use.
I see. Fascinating. How do you, just out of curiosity, I can see how one might recruit students on a college campus through some of the mechanisms you described earlier. I have to imagine it's going to be a lot more difficult recruiting people from the greater community. How do you plan on tackling that?
Yeah. So in our ongoing developmental study, we have RAs go out into the community, right? This is pre-COVID when we recruited this sample. They go to events, they go to games, they go to Beale Street, other sort of downtown Memphis locations.
Okay. So Beale Street's where it's happening in Memphis, right? That's where
Beale Street is the Bourbon Street of Memphis.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
No, there's no open container law, right? So it's our sort of mini Bourbon Street, and so we do face-to-face recruiting, but we get most of our people through advertisements on Google and Facebook and Instagram and other social media sites, and so we recruit people who are social drinkers, right? Because if you put out an ad and ask for heavy drinkers, you'll get a very different group. We want people with a range of drinking practices. But then when we screen them over the phone, we only enroll people who are above a certain risk threshold.
I see.
And then we compensate them for their all their research appointments.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Well, I'll keep my fingers crossed with your grant, and we'll look forward to hearing how this piece of research goes. It sounds, again, absolutely fascinating. So, as you're describing this, it sounds like, or let me, I guess, phrase it differently. if this is successful and if you can get some replications out of this, would you see this as presenting a different standard of care for people with problem drinking? Fast forwarding, 10, 15 years, possibly a generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think brief motivational interventions are already now the standard of care. They're actually required for accreditation for trauma centers. So that is out there. The part that we're adding to that is this idea of, if you want to encourage somebody to do some sort of negative behavior less, you're more likely to get traction if you also facilitate increases in a positive behavior, right? So
that's the piece I'm speaking to.
Yeah. I'm very passionate about that. And I really do think that has potential, in part, and this is the argument that I made in the grant application. One of the biggest problems with motivational interventions for alcohol is that people don't want them, right? Like if you could advertise them, you could make them free. People won't call and sign up to get them because people don't really want to change their drinking. So you have to incentivize participation or if there's sanctions, right? But what we call this the substance-free activity session, which is this sort of positive activity session. I could envision advertising a session on, for young people, helping you to achieve your goals and increase positive activities, right? You could potentially market that in a way that brings people in the door, right? And if you bring people in the door and you start by talking about what's important to you, what are your goals, how do you like to spend your time, they readily engage in that conversation versus starting with, here's how your drinking compares to other students, other people, right? Like, even though motivational interviewing makes that all non-confrontational, at the end of the day, the content can elicit defensiveness because you're giving people feedback about a stigmatized behavior, right? Namely, drinking a lot. So I really think that approaches that start by increasing the positive behaviors can have more potential for dissemination versus approaches that are about doing some risk behavior less.
I see. I can see the logic of that. I want to, it reminds me of some of those kind of like intervention shows. It's like, let's talk about your drinking. It's like no. It's like no. How about we talk about I don't know, anything else? And so I think when we talk about the intervention for individuals with various types of substance abuse disorder, there's a lot of kind of, I guess, stereotypes and tropes and things like that come up. And I think like things like the intervention you mentioned, abstinence as a mechanism of, or a type of treatment, or a type of goal for treatment, I suppose, and things like that. And in particular, the 12-step models, one of the things I want to ask you about is, what do we know about that? Because that seems to be like, I think if you just pick someone randomly in public and said, how do most people quit drinking? And, their first answer is going to probably, if they don't have personal experience with, kind of an intervention like you've just described or something like that, it's going to be AA or some other type of AA, NA, or whatever the various derivatives of that are. What does the research tell us about those approaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is where knowledge really has evolved over the last 20 years, right? So when I was in graduate school, there was this antagonism between quote unquote science-based addiction treatment like CBT and MI versus AA or other 12-step approaches, right? And that was largely because the foundational model for AA is completely sort of not an evidence-based or a scientific model, right? It's sort of integration of a moral model that addiction is a spiritual weakness, and that addiction recovery requires this substantial moral sort of awakening, right? And that the way to recover is to commit to a lifelong of abstinence, to work the 12 steps in order, right? And to give yourself over to a higher power, to assume that you have no agency, you're powerless in the face of alcohol. And so there was a natural antagonism between that approach that was also, manifest in treatment settings that would only hire people that had themselves been through recovery, right?
Sure.
And then on the other hand, you have these behavior therapists who are just saying, this is hogwash, but this makes no sense, right? So then there was what was called Project Match, which was this huge clinical trial, multi-site, $10 million study by NIH in the early 90s, that was going to finally show that CBT and MI were better than this other condition called 12-step facilitation. And to the chagrin of me and many other CBT folks at the time, there was no difference between those three conditions, right? They all worked, right? But there was no difference, right? So what have we learned over the last 10 years? What we've learned over the last 20 years, I guess, is that AA and NA are highly effective, right? They are not effective for the reasons that their model suggests that they are effective, right? They are effective because they enhance social support very effectively, more effectively than traditional treatment where you're coming into the office and meeting with a psychologist or a social worker, and there's boundaries, and you're not going to be their friend. There's the sort of therapeutic boundaries, right? In AA, you're going to a group who, you're meeting people. You have a sponsor. You have somebody you could call at 11 o'clock at night and will hang out with you if you're having a rough time, right? That's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly effective. And there's lots of great research by John Kelly from Harvard and other people suggesting that AA works. And the reason it works is because it increases social support. That said, it's important to point out that AA is not a formal treatment, right? And it pains me that sometimes our healthcare system relegates addiction treatment to go to AA. And the reason why that's a problem is that AA does not provide any assessment. There's no quality control. You could go to a meeting, there might not be anybody there, or there might be somebody there who's hitting on you, right? Or who, is your old neighbor who you couldn't stand, right? So it works. It's obviously free, so that's really good, right? But I think that as a society, if we want to treat addiction as it should be treated, like any other health condition, AA is a tool, but it's not treatment, right? It's not, there's no professional element to it. So that's sort of, I think, what the state of the science is with AA and NA.
I see. That's incredibly enlightening. I appreciate you walking us through that. Just got a couple more questions here for you, Jim. And I know we've kind of gotten into this and kind of incidentally throughout the conversation here, but as we talked about early on in our chat here, you talked about the basic behavioral science and how that's that was an important part of your graduate training. As it relates to that, how has that really informed your applied research in terms of again, getting back to the whole kind of delayed discounting, behavioral economics, all that stuff that was really, really at least popular, at least at Auburn at the time. And you can also assume that our audience has some familiarity with behavioral economics. We've done a few shows on it, certainly. But I'd love to give you an opportunity to expand on that a little bit if there's more you have to say on it.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the biggest way, and this is what we've talked about, is that it's led me to appreciate that if you want to assess risk for drug and alcohol use, it's important to assess not only how much somebody drinks and the problems they've had from drinking, but also how much do they enjoy drinking relative to the other activities they engage in. And there's a big difference between one person who might drink, let's say a young adult who drinks, 10 or 20 drinks a week, but they're engaged in a lot of other reinforcing activities, right? Versus another person who might drink that amount, but drinking is like the only thing that sort of lights up their brain, right? That latter person is at much greater risk. And prior to our work, people didn't assess that, right? It was just assessment was how much do you drink, what problems do you have? So I think assessing, other activities and how much of somebody's sort of reinforcement portfolio is connected to drinking and drug use is one thing that came directly from the matching and the choice literature.
Got it.
The second thing that that I've done a lot of in my career, and others have as well now, is the idea of understanding motivation to use drugs and alcohol via a demand curve approach. And so for those who are not familiar, basic behavioral science and pharmacology, when they are testing out new drugs for whether or not they have the potential to be abused, they will use a demand curve approach where you take first animal subjects and you see how much they will respond on a lever to get a dose of a drug, right? And drugs that are highly reinforcing will generate high levels of operant behavior. The animal will keep pressing the lever in order to get the drug. Drugs that don't have abuse potential, like aspirin or placebos, right? Animals will not press that lever, right? So demand curves use kind of how much behavior you would emit or how much resource you would allocate as a measure of motivation, right? And so as a clinical psychologist sitting in Chris Newland's pharmacology class in 1998, right, I thought, wow, why don't we assess human motivation for using drugs in the same way? So I developed this hypothetical demand curve approach where you provide a scenario and you say first, we did this with young people. Imagine you're in a situation where you have the opportunity to drink, right? If drinks were free, how many drinks would you have, right? If drinks were 25 cents, how many drinks would you purchase and consume? 50 cents, $1, $5, $10, $20, right? And then you plot their consumption as a function of price, and you also plot their expenditures. Like, so if they said they'd have 5 drinks when they're $5, that's $25, right? And so you could precisely quantify the degree of motivation based on how much resource they would allocate and how price sensitive their consumption is, right? And so our research and other folks' research, James McKillop has been a colleague of mine who's done this work with me from day one, it has shown that those measures predict how likely people are to change more so than the traditional measures of how much have you been drinking, right? Because they assess motivation in a more three-dimensional way, in a more context elaborate way, right? So that, and then we've also used those measures to look at like, all right, now imagine you're making those choices and you have a class the next day. Oh, people drink way less, right? Or imagine you're drinking by yourself versus drinking with friends. People drink way less when they're drinking by themselves, right? So you could understand a lot about the situations that will influence drinking through this kind of demand curve approach, which of course is entirely taken from the basic animal literature.
I see. It reminds me, what was that bar that used to have penny wine night?
Yes.
I can't remember what I can picture it in my mind. I just can't remember what the name of the place was. So that's immediately what came to mind as you were describing that. So maybe there were other motivational factors that spurred your interest in this in the Auburn climate, aside from Chris's class, but be that as it may. So yeah. Oh man. And for those who don't know, the taking a class from Chris Newland is an experience to behold. I remember those take-home tests that were just, oh man, just absolutely mind-boggling. So good stuff.
Yes.
We could probably spend quite a bit of time, spinning stories about those days and whatnot. But what I want to do is kind of wrap up here, Jim. And this has been really, really helpful. And I can anticipate many questions from the audience of, who might be interested in studying this. So if you want to perhaps put yourself in the perspective of, most of the audience members are board certified behavior analysts. They're not clinical psychologists. They're not, MSWs or licensed clinical social workers or anything like that. But having said that, let's say, they're interested in this topic and want to learn about this more, or perhaps want to pivot their career into helping people with these types of issues and things like that. What advice would you have for someone in that position?
I would say if you could complete a training in motivational interviewing, I think that's invaluable, whether or not you're working within addiction field. I think for behavior analysts, I'm not sure if that's now part of the training curriculums. Hopefully it is. If not, get training in motivational interviewing. It is a incredible way to communicate with people in a way that reduces resistance and it fosters autonomy and can facilitate behavior change. So that's one. Two, I would try to get as much specialized training in addiction from credible sources as you can. So APA, the American Psychological Association, Division 50 and Division 28 are two addiction-related divisions that provide great resources and training in addiction assessment and treatment. NIAAA, the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. There's that term again that we just can't make go away.
Probably going to be here forever.
Yeah, there is a movement to change that maybe in the next 4 years. NIAAA has great resources. SAMHSA has great resources. Again, addiction treatment is not just about AA or coping skills. It's also about building a new life that is rewarding. And so I think behavior analysts know a lot about positive behavior change and about establishing patterns of behavior that are sort of, pro-social and rewarding. And so I think that is a big part of recovery that there may be a natural role for behavior analysts in.
All right, cool. And I will do my best to run down links to those things and have those in the show notes. I'll also put links to your lab in the show notes as well, in case people want to reach out and say hello. So, Jim, don't know why we waited 3 or 4 years to do this. Let's not let another 3 or 4 years go between doing this again. I want to hear more about some of this research that you're going to be undertaking here very soon.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thank you, Matt.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
Take care.
Hey, everyone. In case you didn't catch this in the introductory comments, Jim was kind enough to stick around and do some patron-only content here. So I'll play a minute or two of it and then fade it out. But if you want to hear the rest of this and you want to hear other types of bonus content and attend member hangouts on Zoom and et cetera, go to patreon.com/behavioral observations and see if there is a tier that fits your interests and budget. Again, that's patreon.com/behavioral observations. And so let's hear a little bit of this footage and then we'll conclude this episode. We've had a number of states legalize cannabis, and we've had either cities or states even legalize psilocybin and things like that. And so I guess one of the things I know we've had private conversations about this last time we were at Auburn, and I'm curious as to what your position is on these sorts of things, and if that position's changed based on the experiences on the ground that we've seen as places like Colorado and Washington, Alaska, and other places have been kind of playing out this natural experiment for the last 5 years or so.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's a complicated issue. I think my views are constantly evolving as data come out. I think this is an issue where we have often conflict between public health and civil liberties, right? And depending on how you value those two domains, your views may differ on this issue. So a couple of things that I think, a couple of my thoughts. A, I don't think we should incarcerate anybody for possession of drugs. So I don't ever think I don't think, so if legalization means moving completely away from incarceration, other than for maybe, very high level dealers, right? I think that is a no-brainer from a public health perspective. I think the best demand reduction approaches are prevention and treatment approaches versus legal approaches. So I think there's good support for that. I think legalization can open the door for treatment. And I think places that legalize.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.